Hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China. The title of this hearing is The Long Arm of China, Exporting Authoritarianism with Chinese Characteristics. I apologize to the witnesses. It's been a pretty busy day this morning, and it's only not even 11 o'clock yet. But we're going to have one panel testifying today. The panel will feature Shanti Kalathil, as the Director of International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy, Dr. Glenn Tifford, an expert in modern Chinese legal history and a visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, Dr. Sophie Richardson, Director of China Research at Human Rights Watch. And I thank all of you for being here. Before we move to the topic at hand, I want to take a moment to recognize Ms. Deidre Jackson on the Commission staff. After 38 years of government work, including nearly 16 years at the Commission, this is her final hearing before retiring, hopefully to Florida. It'll be at the end of this year. And we are very grateful to her for her faithful service and for her important contribution to this work. So the focus of this hearing today is timely. This is an issue that merits greater attention from U.S. policymakers, and that involves the efforts of the Chinese Communist Party through its government to conduct influence operations, which exist in free societies around the globe, and they're intended to censor critical discussion of China's history and human rights record, and to intimidate critics of its repressive policies. Attempts by the Chinese Communist Party and the government to guide, buy, or coerce political influence and control discussion of sensitive topics are pervasive, and they pose serious challenges to the United States and to our like-minded allies. The Commission convened a hearing looking at China's long arm in May of 2016, and the focus at that time was on individual stories from dissidents and right defenders, journalists, family members of critics of the regime who shared alarming accounts of the intimidation, harassment, pressure, and fear they felt as a result of their work. This was especially true for those who had families still living in China, and this issue persists. Just recently, Chinese authorities reportedly detained over 30 relatives of the U.S.-based Uyghur human rights activist Rabea Kadir, a frequent witness before this commission. We'll no doubt hear similar accounts when Dr. Richardson explores some of what Human Rights Watch documented in its recent report on China's interference at the United Nations human rights mechanisms. Beyond that, we hope today to take a step back from individual accounts regarding China's long arm and examine the broader issue of Chinese Communist Party's influence around the world. What animates their efforts? What is their ultimate aim? What sectors or institutions are most vulnerable to this? And what can we do about it? Given the scope of this issue, we'll only begin to scratch the surface here today. When examining these foreign influence operations, it's important we understand the Communist Party infrastructure that exists to support this endeavor. The United Front Work Department is one of the party agencies in charge of influence operations at home and abroad. The Chinese president elevated this entity's status in 2014, calling their work the, quote, magic weapon, unquote, for the Chinese people's great rejuvenation. The UFWD is charged with promoting a positive view of China abroad and exporting the purported benefits of its authoritarian model. United Front officials and their agents, often operating under diplomatic cover as members of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they develop relationships with politicians at both the state, local, and federal level, and other high-profile or up-and-coming foreign and overseas Chinese individuals to, in the words of Wilson Center Global Fellow Anne-Marie Brady, quote, influence, subvert, and if necessary, bypass the policies of their governments and promote the interests of the CCP globally, end quote. A key element in this long-arm effort has focused on information technology and internet governance or sovereignty, asserting national control of the internet and social media platforms, not only in recent domestic cyber legislation and development plans, but also at international gatherings. So we look forward to Ms. Kalathil's testimony, which will further explore this important dimension of the Chinese government's efforts. China's developed tools to surveil social media and mobile phone texting platforms and to disrupt overseas websites that contain content the government finds politically sensitive. Earlier this year, it was reported that real-time censorship of instant messaging platforms is now taking place. Private group chats are censored without users' knowledge. As it relates to China's long arm, the University of Toronto Citizen Lab, a human rights and information technology research center, reported in the middle part of January of this year on Chinese government censors' work to prevent Tibetans inside and outside of China from discussing the Dalai Lama major religious teachings in India. The Chinese government is also clearly targeting academia, The party deems historical analysis and interpretation that do not hew to the party's ideological and official story as dangerous and threatening to its legitimacy. Recent reports of the censorship of international scholarly journals illustrate the Chinese government's direct request to censor international academic content, something which Professor Tiffert will address. Related to this is the proliferation of Confucius Institutes, and with them, insidious curbs on academic freedom. These are a major concern, an area which CECC co-chairman, our co-chairman here, Congressman Smith, has been sounding the alarm on for some time. Chinese foreign investment and development, which is slated to reach record levels with the Belt and Road Initiative, is accompanied by a robust political agenda aimed in part at shaping new global norms on development, trade, and even human rights. There's much more that has been publicly reported in just the last few months, and even more that will likely never be known. The academic whose scholarly paper provides background on the banned Chinese Democratic Party or other politically sensitive issues refused a visa to conduct research in China, or the Hollywood studio that has to shelf film scripts with a storyline involving China's abuse of the Tibetan people, the Washington think tank that puts out policy papers critical of legislative initiatives that would negatively impact the Chinese government, all the while never revealing their financial ties with senior Chinese officials, or the American internet company willing to censor content globally in order to obtain access to the Chinese market. These are endless scenarios. Some I think have happened, some are happening, and some will continue to happen. And it relates directly to Chinese foreign influence operations in both their scope and in their reach. There's an important growing body of research on this topic. So without objection, we will keep the hearing record open for 48 hours to submit some additional relevant materials in that regard, including the executive summary of an important report by the National Endowment for Democracy, Sharp Power, Rising Authoritarian Influence, which outlines in part China's influence operations in young democracies, including 2 of them in our own hemisphere in Latin America. Each year, the Commission releases an annual report which painstakingly documents human rights and rule of law developments in China. China's Great Firewall, rights violations in ethnic minority regions, harassment of rights defenders and lawyers, suppression of free speech, onerous restrictions on civil society. These are the shameful markings of an authoritarian one-party state. But to the extent that the same authoritarian impulses animate the Chinese government's efforts abroad, it directly threatens our most deeply held values and our national interest. The Chinese leaders are engaged in the long game, and it is something that policymakers in the United States and with our like-minded allies must take seriously. Congressman Smith is not here in attendance. He's in the middle of a hearing in the House, but will be with us shortly. I also welcome Senator King. And do you wish to say anything for the record at the opening? And if not, then we're going to welcome our witnesses. And I guess we'll begin with you, Ms. Caliphil, and just work down the row. And I thank you, and I apologize again for our late start. But as I said, it's 11 o'clock, and it feels like it's 5. But thank you for being here, all of you.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Rubio and Senator King. It's a great opportunity to speak to this important topic alongside such expert colleagues. Today, I'll address China's outwardly directed efforts to shape expression and communication globally and the negative implications this poses for democracies. Consider, to begin with, a metaphor sometimes invoked to explain China's domestic approach to the internet, that of the walled garden. The garden is not devoid of color. Indeed, certain flowers are cultivated and allowed to bloom profusely, while those plants, deemed weeds, are yanked out by the root. In this way is the space pruned to fit the preferences of the master gardener. While metaphors are always imperfect, this one does convey important ideas about how the CCP approaches China's information, media, and technology sector. These ideas also have relevance for its international approach, and I'll just briefly touch on 3 key aspects here. First, the technology. The so-called Great Firewall is dependent on an increasingly advanced system of not just censorship, but comprehensive surveillance. It's estimated that there are 170 million CCTV cameras in place, many now enhanced with facial recognition technology, and 400 million new cameras planned in the next 3 years. The Wall Street Journal reported last week on people detained for stray comments made on private chats on the WeChat messaging platform. Government authorities can now identify citizens on the street through facial recognition, monitor all online behavior, and identify potential or even future dissenters and troublemakers. Second, it's not only about the technology. Beijing relies on individuals, corporations, and institutions for not just censorship and self-censorship, but the proactive shaping of norms, narratives, and attitudes. Underpinning all of this activity is the third aspect, Beijing's core economic bargain, which consists of preferential treatment and implicit prosperity for those who respect Beijing's so-called red lines and punishment for those who do not. And while Chinese internet and technology companies have sometimes a not straightforward relationship with the party, they certainly understand this bargain. This combination of aspects results in a system that curtails freedom, suppresses dissent, and manages public opinion, reliant not on any individual element, but on a principle of redundancy built into every layer. Why is this domestic approach relevant to our topic today? Because it is becoming evident that the CCP under Xi Jinping is intent on encompassing the rest of the world within its walled garden. This isn't to say that China seeks to control every facet of communication or that it wants to impose its exact model of authoritarian governance everywhere. But it is increasingly true that Beijing's technology ambitions, combined with its attempts to determine on a global scale the parameters of acceptable speech and opinion with respect to China, pose clear threats to freedom of expression and democratic discourse outside its borders. So how does the Chinese government apply its gardening techniques internationally? First, while it cannot control the infrastructure and technology of the global internet, Chinese companies are actively building out key telecommunications infrastructure in developing countries, raising questions about security and dissemination of censorship capabilities. And if China succeeds in dominating the emerging global market for data-enabled objects, also known as the Internet of Things, its approach to embedded surveillance may become the norm in places with weak individual privacy protections. Meanwhile, the same Chinese tech giants mentioned in that Wall Street Journal story are taking stakes in the firms that provide key global apps and services. Just last Friday, it was reported that WeChat's parent company, Tencent, and Spotify had taken minority stakes in each other. This follows earlier Tencent acquisitions of minority stakes in Snap, the parent company of Snapchat, and Tesla. Artificial intelligence companies such as iFlyTech pioneer the surveillance aims of the government through the use of big data and weak Chinese privacy standards, while also entering into deals with industry leaders such as Volkswagen and others. It is reasonable to ask whether Chinese firms with global ambitions plan to follow the same explicit and/or unspoken party dictates with respect to data gathering, surveillance, and policing of quote-unquote sensitive communication abroad as they do at home. These technological advances also dovetail with Beijing's efforts to shape the internet and other future technologies through key internet governance bodies and discussions, as Chairman Rubio mentioned. The Chinese government's initially derided World Internet Conference in Wuzhen succeeded this year in attracting high-level Silicon Valley participation, including Apple CEO Tim Cook. Importantly, it established the optic that the world's leading technology firms have blessed China's approach to the internet. And I'll briefly touch on some of these other aspects, the second of which is that it's never only about the technology. The Chinese government has spent tens of billions of dollars to shape norms, narratives, and attitudes in other countries, relying on the cultivation of relationships with individuals, educational and cultural institutions, and centers of policy influence. And this is detailed in our new report on sharp power. Finally, underlying all of this is China's carrot and stick contract with the rest of the world. The global walled garden approach would not be possible were governments, universities, publishers, Hollywood, technology, and other companies not roped into this implicit and sometimes explicit bargain. Therefore, it's both timely and necessary for democratic governments and civil society to be proactive in asserting why norms such as transparency, accountability, and pluralism are critical to their interests. And I'll reserve the rest of my suggestions on that front for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tifford, are you prepared? I think you're going to go next, because he's closer to his PowerPoint. Thank you for being here. Don't mind turning the microphone. There you go.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the Commission. I'm very pleased to be invited to speak to today's hearing. I've long followed the Commission and the work that it does. In recent years, technology has supercharged the dark art of agitprop, that potent combination of political agitation and propaganda Russian revolutionaries gave to the world more than a century ago. While attention now centers on how its devotees have exploited social media to sow mistrust, intimidate, provoke, and polarize, for China such chicanery is but one facet of a much more ambitious program. The Chinese Communist Party is leveraging its economic muscle and the technologies of the information age to pursue a distinctively Leninist path to soft power. It depicts public opinion as a battlefield upon which a highly disciplined political struggle must be waged and won. Inspired by Mao's call to use the past to serve the present, and to make foreigners serve China, the CCP is furthermore quietly exporting its domestic censorship regime abroad, enlisting observers everywhere, often without their knowledge or consent, in an alarming effort to sanitize the historical record and globalize its own competing narratives. Its timing is impeccable. Economic and technological disruptions to our information ecosystem are eroding our capacity to detect, much less combat this information war. Motivated by thrift and efficiency, many universities in particular are shedding old volumes and outsourcing growing parts of their collections to online providers, trusting these providers to provide full replacement value and to guarantee the integrity of their products. Much can go wrong with that bargain, particularly since many of these providers are market-driven ventures, subject to commercial pressures. They may adhere to different values, priorities, and standards of stewardship than traditional libraries, and may be accountable to different constituencies. Furthermore, things can go spectacularly wrong when they confront the demands of a mercurial censorship regime and the authoritarian government behind it, as with the PRC. The providers who control those servers can silently alter our knowledge base without ever leaving their back offices, making one non-destructive edit after another, each propagating nearly instantaneously around the world. For censors, the possibilities are mouthwatering. Digital databases offer them dynamic, fine-grained mastery over memory and identity, and in the case of China, they are capitalizing on this to engineer a pliable version of the past that can be tuned algorithmically to always serve the parties present. As George Orwell once wrote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Consider, for instance, the dominant academic law journals published in the Mao-era PRC, which document the emergence of China's post-1949 legal system and the often savage debates that seized it. The online editions of these journals have been redacted in ways that distort the historical record but are largely invisible to the end user. The consequences are unsettling. The more faithful foreign scholars are to this adulterated source base, and the sanitized reality it projects, the more they may be unwittingly serving China by promoting the agendas of the censors. Now, what does this look like? I offer to you the first slide, an example of the table of contents from a leading Chinese law journal from the 1950s. On the left is the original scan of the original paper edition issued in the 1950s. To the right is the actual table of contents presented online. Now, I've put red arrows to indicate the articles that are simply invisible. They're gone. They're missing from the online edition. It represents 30 of the journal's 72 pages, including the first 9 lead articles. They've vanished, been erased from the historical record. Using information technology, the Chinese government and its censors are sculpting this historical record in highly targeted ways, trimming away the inconvenient bits to produce exactly the shape they want. The stakes today are real. Consider, for example, Yang Jiaolong, one of the most brilliant legal minds of his generation. In the early Mao era, Yang and quite a few like him forcefully promoted a raft of concepts connected to the rule of law. But they paid a terrible price for making those arguments. Yang himself was branded a revolutionary and spent 12 years in prison. This presents a very awkward background history for a regime that has since not only written the rule of law into its constitution, but also presents its policy of socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics as the culmination of an originalist vision. And in these graphs I present to you, the red lines indicate the historical record that's been erased from every issue of these journals over a period of several years. They've essentially eliminated the footprint of these individuals and the arguments they made in support of the rule of law historically in China. Now, it's worth noting that the computational techniques I employed to analyze the censorship are double-edged weapon. They can be repurposed to automate and enhance the work of the censors. Simply by manipulating any of the parameters in my data set, a censor can fabricate bespoke versions of the historical record, each exquisitely tuned to the requirements of the present. It's a very short hop indeed from the technologies that already dynamically filter our news feeds to the nightmare of Orwell's memory hole. And this is an old-fashioned version of how they used to do that. This is a photo of the procession of Mao's funeral. One includes the Gang of Four, and then shortly after their arrest, the photo was reissued with the Gang of Four erased. To be clear, the censorship is directed foremost at controlling China's sense of itself. It's tendentiously distorting memory and identity. It's prejudicing China's possible futures and violating the trust of the people who use these sources. But insofar as we foreign observers are increasingly reliant on these censored sources and online providers, it's also enlisting us in a campaign to promote the party's agenda. This is disinformation on a grand scale, turbocharged by emerging technologies, and I expect that we will see much more of it around the world in coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chairman Rubio and Senator King. Many thanks for the timely hearing and for your principled and persistent leadership on human rights issues in China. We also want to thank you for your strong statement on International Human Rights Day and another excellent report. In January 2017, Chinese President Xi Jinping gave a keynote speech at the Palais des Nations in Geneva. Although world leaders regularly give addresses there, few other occasions have seen the UN impose restrictions such as those instituted on this occasion. Before Xi's arrival, UN officials closed parking lots and meeting rooms and sent home early many of the office's approximately 3,000 staff. The UN also barred non-governmental organizations from attending the speech. Just a few months later, in April, security officials at the UN headquarters in New York City ejected from the premises Dolkan Issa, an ethnic Uyghur rights activist originally from China. Issa, who was accredited as an NGO participant, was attending a forum on indigenous issues when UN security confronted him and ordered him out of the building. No explanation was provided, and Human Rights Watch queries to the UN spokesperson's office elicited no substantive information about the incident. The UN plays a crucial role in holding governments to their international human rights obligations and helping to protect human rights. And as a result, the UN's handling of these situations points to larger concerns about the treatment and protection of human rights activists critical of China as they seek to participate in UN efforts, and about China's attempts to thwart UN scrutiny of its own human rights record. Those mechanisms are intended to protect the rights of all and are now among the only means of redress for independent activists from the mainland. Taken individually, many of China's actions against NGOs might be viewed as an annoyance or an irritant, but taken together, they amount to what appears to be a systematic attempt to subvert the ability of the UN human rights system to confront abuses in China and beyond. As a UN member state and party to several international human rights treaties, China engages with the UN human rights system. It is a member of the Human Rights Council, participates in reviews of its treaty compliance in the Universal Periodic Review process, and allows some, but not all, UN independent human rights experts to visit China. But even as it engages with those institutions, China has worked consistently and often aggressively to silence criticism of its human rights record before UN bodies, and has taken actions aimed at weakening some of the central mechanisms available there, which in turn poses a longer-term challenge to the integrity of the UN human rights system as a whole. In a September 2017 report, we detailed how Chinese officials have harassed activists, primarily those from China, by photographing and filming them on UN premises in violation of UN rules, and by restricting their travel to Geneva. Members of this commission need no reminding about the case of Cao Shanli. China has also used its membership on the UN's Economic and Social Council's NGO committee to block NGOs critical of China from being granted UN accreditation, and it has sought to blacklist accredited activists. Behind the scenes, Chinese diplomats, in violation of UN rules, have contacted UN staff and experts on treaty bodies and special procedures, including behavior that has at times amounted to harassment and intimidation. China has also repeatedly sought to block or weaken UN resolutions on civil society, human rights defenders, and peaceful protests, including when they do not directly concern policy and practice in China. It has pushed back against efforts to strengthen some of the key mechanisms, notably country-specific resolutions on grave situations like North Korea and Syria, and efforts to strengthen treaty body reviews. During UN peacekeeping budget consultations earlier this year, China sought to slash funding for UN human rights officers, who play a vital role in monitoring alleged human rights abuses in some of the world's most dangerous places. Since our report's release, Chinese officials on 2 separate UN sessions called out UN experts for raising individual cases from China, suggesting that doing so was a violation of their mandates. In September, China tied Saudi Arabia for the most mentions in an important UN report on reprisals by governments against activists who engage with UN human rights mechanisms. Recent Chinese efforts to spearhead UN initiatives, such as presidential statements and resolutions at the Human Rights Council, foreshadow a more active, prominent role for China and give rise to concern about ways it will exercise its power. As a powerful P5 member of the UN Security Council, China has a particular weight on the Human Rights Council. It has played an influential role together with other members of the self-proclaimed like-minded group, many of whom have poor human rights records. China is not alone in its obstructionist tactics, but it should not become a powerful role model for others that hope to hobble UN human rights bodies. Many of China's actions are directly at cross purposes with UN efforts to improve its human rights system. And while UN officials have at times pushed back against improper Chinese pressure or steadfastly ignored it, in other instances they have capitulated or have soft-pedaled their concerns, presumably to avoid confrontation with China. Unless the UN and concerned governments can halt China's encroachments, the UN's ability to help protect rights around the globe is at risk, not only in Geneva. We have several recommendations for you, but I just want to highlight three very quickly. The first is that China's next review under the Universal Periodic Review process is in 2018. We urge that the Commission consider a letter to the Chinese ambassador here, spelling out the ways in which independent Chinese civil society should be able to participate in that process. In the context of US support to UN Secretary General Guterres' reform plan, we urge the UN to adopt the recommendations about China articulated in our report, but we also urge that Guterres himself call out China when it violates UN rules, and urge Guterres to ensure that the UN is calling out China for its human rights violation. There are 24 different UN agencies in the mainland. Very few of them are willing to speak about human rights at all. Last but not least, I think there is ample scope for this commission, for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and for the House Foreign Affairs Committee to conduct vigorous research and public discussions into Chinese influence in the US, whether that's about the integrity of electoral systems, whether it's about academic freedom, whether it's about domestic media practices. I think all of these issues require further scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Let me turn to Senator King. You were here earlier. You have some questions.
Yeah, I'm assuming we can sort of go back and forth, but
Yeah, it's not very crowded right now.
I'm not sure who to address this to. I have a sort of a technical question. We all know that the Chinese censor the internet. How do they do it physically? Do they own the pipes? How does that censorship occur? Do they own? Are they the owners of the distribution system, Dr. Tivert?
There are a handful of gateways that sit between the lines that enter China and the domestic Chinese internet, and it's through those gateways that enter the country in various places, interconnects, where they have very large server farms that are performing real-time analysis of the data going back and forth, filtering it, checking by protocols, by content. They lead the world in this.
But they're also censoring their own people.
Oh, they are. That's right, and they do that at the level
through the control of the pipes.
Yes, they do that at the level of the individual ISPs, the providers domestically who will filter data, and they also do that through the firms that deliver services who are required to adhere and enforce party policy. For example, news sites, entertainment sites are required to implement any party directives that come down to erase coverage of a particular topic or not to cover it at all.
Well, I can't help but note that tomorrow our FCC is about to make a disastrous decision to essentially turn the control of the internet over to the owners of the pipes. And it seems to me that makes it easier to censor and to control because, and what if a Chinese company took a significant ownership share in one of our large telecommunication companies? I mean, this decision that's being made tomorrow is terrible on a lot of levels, but it seems to me it makes it easier to censor the internet because you're getting the control away from the public, the FCC, the people, to the people who own the connections.
I'll just add 2 quick points. First, whenever I agree entirely with what Professor Tivert has just said. Whenever we've done research on this topic, we have also found that companies, both Chinese and foreign ones, have voluntarily censored topics that they thought were problematic before they had even actually been asked to do so by any Chinese government authority. And so we have long urged that companies should have to answer questions about whether they were actually asked to do these things, whether they were forced to comply with some real or perceived Chinese law, or whether they had done it voluntarily. Flip it around, and if you look at some of the Chinese companies that are now conducting business overseas, for example, Alipay, is now offering services in Japan, not yet here, I think. But I think there are real questions to be asked about what happens when you click that accept the terms of service box, because we know that Alipay and Alibaba aggregate data and hand it over to Chinese security forces. And if you're a person standing outside China, but you're using Alibaba services, does that mean that your information, too, is going back to the Ministry of Public Security?
It worries me that, one of the reasons it's so hard to censor our internet is it's so chaotic and decentralized. And by flipping that over, which we think is likely to happen tomorrow in one of the most wrong-headed decisions I've ever encountered, we're making it easier to have those kinds of controls. Any evidence of Chinese direct intervention or intention to intervene directly in our electoral process a la the Russians? No, everybody's shaking their heads. The record won't show head shakes.
I'm not sure that there's any evidence that demonstrates that yet, though it's something that people should be paying attention to.
Aren't there some recent incidents in Australia of
Yes.
direct intervention in the electoral process?
Yes, and there's great concern in New Zealand as well.
Is there any reason to think it couldn't happen here?
It's certainly a possibility.
Can I interject on this? Is an important point. So when you answer no, I think what you're answering, and if I'm wrong, please correct me. I don't want anybody to say that I'm leading you in your answer, because I want your views on this to be accurately reflected. The question was, how does it compare to Russian interference? And I think the answer you've given is there's no evidence that they're posting stuff on Twitter or Facebook for purposes of dividing the American people against each other. On the other hand, Senator King asked about Australia. What we have seen around the world, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is an effort to identify and nurture office holders, think tanks, opinion makers, journalists, academia, and encourage them both to enter in public service and even to rise. We've seen open source reports, for example, of outreach to local and state elected officials, perhaps anticipating that one day they will hold federal office. Or we've seen reports of implied threats to cut off access to the Chinese market for companies based in certain states unless those states' authorities are cooperative or make statements friendly towards their cause. So I would argue that is influence. I think it's different. I think it's softer, more subtle, more long-term, but nevertheless, it reflects what we saw in Australia, where a member of parliament resigned after there were accusations made that not only had he tipped off a Chinese national of some alleged intelligence operation being conducted against him, but that he perhaps allegedly had received cash from a wealthy Chinese national, which he had used to pay off personal debts. Again, no evidence that that has occurred in the United States, but that level of influence, trying to play in the politics and nurture a view and individuals who hold views friendly to the narrative they're trying to put out, that you have seen evidence of.
Do you want to?
Absolutely, and I think in one sense what distinguishes the Chinese efforts to wield influence in the United States is that they are spending a great deal more money to do that. They have commercial advantages, and so they're able through, for example, Confucius Institutes to promote a particular view of China and to close out discussion of certain topics on campus. They're able to donate money to particular causes. Much of this is legal activity, but they're able simply to wield influence because they can write checks. And that is something that we did not face as a country during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Their pockets were not as deep. China is not necessarily appealing to hearts and minds, it's appealing to wallets.
I would also add that, in our recent report on sharp power, we explicitly looked at Chinese influence in young democracies and vulnerable democracies and found that through a number of different avenues, including through investments in the media, including through massive investments in people-to-people exchanges, the Chinese government is really promoting a certain narrative. And that narrative, of course, then enables it to achieve its own interests in various ways. So while it may be hard to point a finger at specific election-related issues or specific political meddling at the moment, there's no doubt that there are massive and extreme efforts to exert influence through a number of things that otherwise would have been seen as soft power, perhaps through a different lens. But when you consider that the aim of buying up media outlets, particularly Chinese language media outlets, but not limited to that, is really to shape a narrative and to constrain discourse about China in particular, rather than to open the discourse and to enable many different critical perspectives. And that also is a very long-term and pernicious form of influence.
This is really a clash of values in terms of open communication, free speech, and those kinds of things. I mean, it seems to me there's a continuum. I mean, we have people-to-people programs. We bring students from other parts of the world here. We have various information about our country that has to use your term, a positive narrative. But at some point, the question is, where does puffery stop and I don't know what the right word might be, but some kind of subversion begin. Let me ask a question. I've had recent information, large number of Chinese students in America making great contributions to our schools. I've known many of them in graduate schools, undergraduate schools. Is there any evidence that the Chinese government is recruiting some of those students as agents of either gathering intelligence or otherwise malign activities in our country? Again, I see a lot of nods. That you got to speak up.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I could take that and answer the last one a little bit. We've been doing some research for a couple of years on threats to academic freedom from the Chinese government outside China, and a piece of that has involved looking at the realities for students and scholars who are originally from the mainland on campuses in the US, Australia, and elsewhere. And certainly, it's not a new pathology that Chinese government officials want to know what those students and scholars are saying in classrooms. One doesn't have a perfect year-on-year data set to say that it's gotten worse, but it's certainly a sufficiently real dynamic for people. For example, we have a graduate student who told us about something that he discussed in a closed seminar at a university here, and 2 days later his parents got visited by the Ministry of Public Security in China asking why their kid had brought up these touchy topics that were embarrassing to China in a classroom in the US. So I think that surveillance is real. If I can just back up slightly to the previous question, I think there are a lot worse uses of resources than to try to replicate Professor Anne-Marie Brady's work with respect to the US. I think part of what's most extraordinary, this is the research that was done on New Zealand about that paper, is that it was all open source material and nobody came out looking good. And it really did, I think, Senator King, get to the issue that you're talking about, that it's fine to have relationships, but at what point does that cross a line into trying to achieve a certain kind of political outcome? So I think that would not be hard to do. I think it's essential. You could certainly look at which members of Congress, for example, have had their travel sponsored by different Chinese government entities, many of which, of course, don't necessarily have names that immediately convey that they're government entities. But I think it was reported by the Globe and Mail last week that the current Canadian ambassador, who's fairly new in Beijing, had received the largest amount of money of any sitting MP in the previous government from Chinese government agencies to underwrite travel to China. I think these are hard questions that need to get asked about who's participating in what and under what auspices. And forgive me if this is a slightly uncomfortable thing to say, but I think there are questions also to be asked about why there was a representative of the Republican National Committee at a meeting of political parties sponsored by the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing last week. I don't know, I've asked if there was somebody from the Democratic National Committee too, but there were representatives of Democratic political parties from all over the world, and again, not necessarily illegal, but I think it goes to legitimizing a political party that's anything but democratic.
Well, as Senator Ruby and I both know, serving on the Intelligence Committee, it's a short jump from supporting a candidate to trying to take out a candidate you don't like. And that is, of course, we've seen the Russians doing that around the world. And the question is that, We aren't there yet. Is that a likelihood? Is that a possibility? I think that's a reasonable concern. And what's going on here is, I called it geopolitical jujitsu, where you're using your opponent's strengths as also their weaknesses. Our strength is our openness, our free society, our First Amendment, our protected expression, and that's being used by our adversaries to undermine our system. It's kind of an ironic turn, using our own values against us, and that's what's concerning to me, because any country in the world could look at what the Russians did here in 2016 and say, wow, that worked. It was pretty cheap, and here's another avenue for influence.
But just to drill down on that point, there are different ways of influencing. There's the more frontal, traditional approach that we have seen evidence of in 2016, and that involves the posting and the driving of certain information in order to exploit divisions, existing divisions within a society in and of itself. And I've opined publicly that that's my view, that more than anything else, this was designed to create chaos within the political order in the United States and sow instability and ensure that the next president, whoever that was, inherited societal conflict and a political mess. And what you're describing is different. It is a changing the environment in which that debate is occurring, particularly as it relates to a particular country's worldview. And you all keep going back, and I think Dr. Tiffert, you talked about that in your opening statement. You described efforts to project a, quote, China model globally as an alternative to the liberal order, which for decades has, since the end of World War II, is anchored by the United States. So I would ask all of you, if you can concisely, what is the narrative? What is this model? What is the message that they are pushing? In essence, what do they want us to accept as conventional wisdom about China and its role in the world and international norms in 10, 15, 20 years? What are they asking people to buy into?
Well, I would briefly say that in this instance, it's instructive to look at the rhetoric surrounding China's Belt and Road Initiative. The key phrase that is attached to that initiative is community of common destiny. And I think it's notable that, you talked about how authoritarian regimes are trying to use democracy's openness against them. They're also subverting the rhetoric of democracy. They are explicitly using terms like openness and community and terms that seem to imply a sort of networked model of the world that is not unlike that pushed by the liberal international order over the last many years. The difference is that there is also underlying all of this a quite explicit message of non-interference in sovereignty, and that, of course, in China's case, fits directly into its worldview and how it would like other countries to treat it. And you see this also in its approach to internet governance. You see it in many of its different initiatives. But it's notable that I would say China is not trying to say, be just like us. It is actually trying to use this very inclusive language to paint a picture that seems like a reasonable alternative to the liberal international order, one that appeals to small states, to countries that feel vulnerable, to those that feel that they might be safer or have more of a say in a multipolar world. And it is this sort of approach that I think is actually new and more sophisticated, and one that we actually have to think deeply about how to address.
Good morning, Mr. Smith. It's hard to improve on that. I'll just give you one quick example. Last weekend, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs hosted a South-South cooperation on human rights gathering. And the concluding document from that contained quite a bit of language that at first blush sounds sort of like UN language about human rights. It actually mentioned universality, somewhat disingenuously, but at least the word was there. But it, like some of the Chinese government's other efforts, for example, in UN resolutions, again, sort of pushed the idea of sovereignty or national conditions or, with Chinese or swap in another country's name characteristics, right? That always creates the opportunity for a state to opt out of or not have to yield to international standards. And I think China is really seeking active partnership and global support for that idea. And at the same time, pointing to the US and pointing to Brexit and saying, I think much more clearly and aggressively that electoral democracy doesn't work, it's a failure, and that their system is superior.
I would add to those excellent points also that China is doing a very good job of keeping its so-called alternative China model to the liberal international order deliberately vague so that different regimes can read into it what they choose to simply as an alternative to what they might regard as having to respond to demands from Western donors and Western governments about things like human rights, transparency, reducing corruption, environmental protection, and other factors. For them, it's a direct appeal to the elites that might be in governing these already authoritarian or marginally democratic regimes, and it works in their self-interest. And to the extent that China is willing to bankroll economic development without the conditions attached that organizations like the World Bank might attach, then it's win-win for China and for the elites who govern these other countries.
And Congressman Smith has joined us. I'm going to recognize him in a moment while he gets organized because I want to finish these thoughts, and this is really at the core of what this hearing is about. A couple things you've touched on. The first, and you said it earlier in response to Senator King, is let me back up and say that we often are guilty of ascribing our domestic political attributes to foreign actors, right? Or foreign nations, other nations. We think to ourselves, this is what it means here, so this is what it must mean over there. So when the United States, whether it's McDonald's or Coca-Cola or Apple or Facebook, go to another country, they are not there at the behest of the United States government. They're not even under the control of the United States government. And oftentimes in academia, perhaps more often than not in many cases, they're certainly not under our control. In fact, many times go abroad and are critical of their own country and vice versa, which is their right in a free society. One of the things we've heard from you today is that when you look at the toolbox, the influence toolbox that the Chinese Communist Party has in its government, all of these things are part of that toolbox. In essence, when you are engaging in commercial relationships with a Chinese company, potentially a large one in essence, you're not dealing with an independent multinational actor. You are dealing with an entity that grew large and is capable of operating because they are willing to be cooperative and in some cases act as an agent on behalf of whatever it is being asked of them. And I think that poses threats up and down, from technological transfers, the embedding information and technology that can ultimately wind up here in this country because somebody's using that equipment for our telecom networks, all the way to the information about what you buy on a certain website or your credit card and biographical information. And that's a real important distinction. And the other point that you talked about was kind of buying into the non-interference argument. And here's where we have a couple examples of how this effort is bearing fruit in different parts of the world. So we had a vote I guess back in the summer of this year, in which Greece blocked a European Union statement at the United Nations criticizing China's human rights record. And there was a lot of, what is that all about? And then you look further and you realize that China's Costco Shipping is the owner of the world's 4th largest container fleet, had just taken a 51% stake in Greece's largest port last year. So again, you tie those two things together, maybe they're related, maybe they're not, I believe that they are, but you start to see where the political of a large Chinese company, the economic angle, the economic power of a large Chinese conglomerate is able to wield influence over a smaller economy and how it votes at an international forum. Then we have the issue of access to this large market that people are dying for. And so, again, this is where you come into this absurd situation where the World Internet Conference is held in China, meant to promote China's vision of cyber sovereignty, which all of you have talked about. Basically, the idea that governments all over the world should have the right to control what appears on the internet in their countries. The most confusing part of it all is that Apple's CEO, Tim Cook, stood up at that conference and he celebrated China's vision of an open internet. He delivered the keynote speech on the opening day of that gathering. He wasn't there alone, by the way. He was joined by, some of the other attendees from Google and Cisco. But the most ironic part about it is that in a written response to questions to our colleagues, Senator Leahy and Senator Cruz, back in June, or earlier this year, I'm not remember the month, maybe it was back in November, Apple admitted that it had removed 674 VPN apps from its App Store in China. These are tools that allow users, of course, to circumvent censorship by routing traffic through other countries. And to comply with what they said they were complying with local law, Skype was also removed from Apple's China store, as was reported by the New York Times. So again, here's an example of a company, in my view, so desperate to have access to the Chinese marketplace that they are willing to follow the laws of that country, even if those laws run counter to what the company's own standards are supposed to be. And a good example for the United States and for our people, how some of these individuals who like to come here and lecture us about free speech and human rights and domestic problems then go abroad and are fully cooperative on some grotesque violation of human rights because there's a lot of money to be made and they don't want to offend their host country. And then the last thing I would point to, before I turn it over to Congressman Smith, is there's the story that we all now are aware of a University of Maryland valedictorian who experienced, after her commencement speech where she praised free speech in the U.S. as a breath of fresh air, she experienced this sort of onslaught of online attacks. And in your written testimony, Ms. Callithel, you wrote how Chinese government fabricates about 448 million social media comments a year to inject certain narratives. But that's unfortunately not an isolated case. We have a number of others, and these are just a handful. An overseas university provoked complaint. This month, for example, a lecturer, this article's dated, but at some point, a lecturer from Monash University in Australia was suspended after a Chinese student complained on Weibo of a classroom quiz that appeared to insult Chinese officials. In 2010, the University of Calgary announced that China's education ministry had removed it from the list of accredited overseas institutions. That came weeks after that university had awarded an honorary degree to the Dalai Lama. We saw how the University of California at San Diego prompted the local chapter of the Chinese Students and Scholars Association to threaten, quote, tough measures to resolutely resist the school's unreasonable behavior because they had planned a speech by the Dalai Lama. So you start to see these things. These are all evidence of the different tools in that toolbox, which leads me to my final question for all of you, and that is, well, my final question here, because Congressman Smith has questions for you too. Obviously, you are outspoken on this cause. All of you have done a significant amount of work. We have read some of the efforts that have been used to intimidate or otherwise. Are any of you willing to share any experiences you have had based on your work, whether it's efforts to discredit it, whether it's efforts to influence people against their opinion or beyond? What have you experienced, if anything? Maybe you've experienced nothing, but what have you experienced as a result of the work you've done on this topic? And in particular, appearing here at this hearing today, we often find that our witnesses in these hearings, especially if they're Chinese and have family back home, face consequences for that. But in your particular cases, have you ever faced anything that made you feel as if it was a result of your work on this topic?
Personally, I have not to date within the United States. In China, working on the topics that I work on, I come under significant pressure, and the informants and people that I speak to also do. And I think that goes with the territory, and it's well recognized among people who work on modern China and contemporary issues in China. I have to say that in the classroom, I've not experienced any negative activity or any of the personal outrage that we've seen at other universities, say in Australia. To my teaching, I've been spared that. I found Chinese students to be extremely thoughtful and even open-minded about issues that are passionately felt at home. But there definitely is the danger, and early career academics are highly conscious of this, that there's always the possibility that a minority might express unhappiness or outrage at something that is taught because it's different than the way they've been taught it. And that produces unwelcome controversy. And for faculty, because of the decline of tenure, faculty become risk averse. They don't want to cause controversy because they're also concerned that their universities may not adequately support them in the event that the Chinese students on Scholars Association or even a smaller group of students take issue with something that happens in the classroom. And so there's a self-censorship, a chilling of speech that occurs as well.
Yeah, I also have not personally experienced that in particular, but I would concur with Dr. Tiffert's views on, as I've taught classes, I think some of the Chinese students in my class are surprisingly willing to be open about their criticisms, and it would be indeed sad if pressure on them by the embassy, which I gather is starting to happen with more regularity, would constrain them from expressing their views in what is meant to be a free and open setting. And that is a trend that I think would be quite terrible.
I can only recall maybe one or two conversations over the years, the dozen years I've been at Human Rights Watch, in which Chinese government officials said anything that might have risen to the level of being threatening, but not certainly not anything that made me change my job. It is, for us, the enormous challenge is about how we are able to do research and correctly calculating what threats to people who talk to us actually are. And that has gotten more challenging over the years, is ensuring the safety of the people that we've interviewed, in the same way that you were talking about the safety or what happens to people who've come and testified before you.
The co-chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank you again for calling this hearing. I apologize for being late. We had a Foreign Affairs Committee meeting with Rex Tillerson behind closed doors that went on for almost 2 hours. And I chaired it for a while and asked him some questions regarding China. It was about reorg, but it was also about issues and the interface between reorganization and China and foreign policy goals. Again, but I want to thank you, Chairman Rubio, because this is a really important hearing, a part of a whole series of hearings you've put together and an initiative. So I want to thank you for your tremendous leadership. I did thank Rex Tillerson for putting China on Tier 3 on the TIP report. It is an egregious violator of trafficking. I wrote the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. If ever there was a country that should have been on it every year, especially in recent years, it is China. The previous administration refused to do it. I held hearings to try to hold them to account for it. There was an automatic downgrade at one point, but that wasn't because of merit, because they were on the watch list for too long. But this was made, and when you read the narrative, it couldn't be more clear that sex trafficking and labor trafficking are exploding in China. They're missing some 62 million females, girls, because of sex selection abortion, which is further driving the demand. And nobody likes to talk about that because it's not politically correct, but I'll talk about it every day of the week. It is a heinous crime against gender, against women, and it now has another consequence, and that is that it drives sex trafficking. I did have a hearing yesterday in my subcommittee on human rights, Africa, Global Health, and Human Rights. A really important hearing, in my opinion. We had two women, and I would appreciate your thoughts on this, who escaped from North Korea into China. They were trafficked. They made it back into North Korea and told how they were beaten, how they were just terribly mistreated, which violates the Refugee Convention, as you know so well, that China has ratified. There's been no consequences over the years for this gross violation of refoulement. I asked Rex Tillerson about that, and he's taking that back, and I said, we need to raise it. We know that our Nikki Haley does raise these issues, but it needs to be a full court press, in my humble opinion, to say China violates the Refugee Convention with impunity, and it's time to end that. There needs to be a sanction. There needs to be certainly a lifting of voices. The periodic review comes up for China in November, I believe it is, of next year, but the NGO submissions begin in the spring. This commission ought to have a very strong statement, and it will, I'm sure, under Mr. Rubio's leadership, to really make it clear that it's about time China was held to account. They have had the long reach of the Chinese dictatorship at the UN for far too long. They get a slap in the wrist, if that, by the Human Rights Council, and obviously China runs interference time and time again. So if you could maybe speak to the issue of these women, mostly, men too, but women who are trafficked, but then they are sent back in violation of that Refugee Convention. On the Confucius one other thing that was raised by Rex Tillerson, maybe I did say this, but I don't think I did. He talked about consolidating the dialogues. You know, we have about 2 dozen dialogues with China at mid-level to 4 major ones. And when he outlined what they were, missing was a human rights dialogue. So I asked him about it. He said that human rights would be integrated into the other dialogues. And I said, I appreciate that. We need a whole-of-government approach. But frankly, this ought to be on its own. Would you have a 5th dialogue at the highest levels on human rights? So they know, without any ambiguity, the United States believe in the fundamental freedoms and human rights that we have enshrined in our Bill of Rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on and so forth. You might want to speak to that because I think that's important. On the World Internet Conference, I want to associate myself with the chairman's remarks. In 2006, I began a series of hearings. The first one was with Yahoo, Microsoft, Cisco, and Google. And I had all of the top people raise their hands, and we swore them in. And for 8 hours, asked questions as to why they were enabling the censorship, why they were part of the apparatus of repression, and their answers were awful. And then when you see Tim Cook talking about, you know, as Mr. Rubio said, the common future, you know, it's an ominous continuing down that path of allowing this repression, this surveillance, this misuse of the internet by the Chinese dictatorship to repress its own people. If you might want to speak to that. And finally, on the Confucius Institutes, we've had a number of hearings on this commission, and as well as in my subcommittee, on the whole issue of the Confucius Institutes as a way, we call it academic malware, where there's an all-out attempt to, again, influence academia, students, Chinese students, but also American students, in a way that would give the party line, and we have them in New Jersey, they're all over the country, and your thoughts on these Confucius Institutes. We all know that heads of colleges and universities are ever in search of more money and more programming, and if it comes free of charge, certainly it's an engraved invitation to say, come to our college or university, and to me, it's an invitation for disinformation. So your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I thought I would address one piece of what you brought up and also what Chairman Rubio addressed in the role of the U.S. and other tech companies going to China and being complicit in practices that enable surveillance and censorship. One really fascinating development that's really just been in the last few years is the inversion of this typical frame. So you've been holding hearings on this since 2006. We've all been very familiar with the behavior of some of the U.S. tech companies when they go to environments like China. And there have been efforts to try to produce more transparency and accountability around their efforts there. What we're seeing now, however, is due to the emergence of these Chinese internet and technology giants, including new artificial intelligence companies, that essential framework has been reversed so that these companies, which have essentially been incubated in an environment where they must do what the party says or they will not profit, are now large enough to begin investing overseas. And so it's no longer simply about US companies going to China and perhaps being complicit in censorship and surveillance. It's about what these really large Chinese internet companies are going to do as they expand globally. And will they bring aspects of the Chinese internet censorship and surveillance system with them? There are initial indications from research done by the Citizen Lab, which was mentioned earlier, that at least with one test run, it was found that accounts that had been registered to WeChat, which is the largest private chat messaging platform, as well as mobile commerce and a host of other things, when devices registered within China were brought without China, they still were not able to access certain sites. And in addition, certain keywords had been censored within chats without people knowing about it. There was no transparency about the censorship. They were only able to determine, the researchers were able to determine this because they ran very specific tests on it. I think this is just the beginning of what could be a larger trend, and one that we also should keep our eye on, in addition to trying to ensure that U.S. companies are not complicit in human rights violations. Thank you.
I'll try to tackle North Korea and the dialogues. Obviously, Human Rights Watch regularly calls out the Chinese government for violating the Refugee Convention, particularly with respect to North Koreans. I don't think China cares at all what we say about that. In a way, honestly, our bigger concern at the moment, particularly as, again, one doesn't have the perfect data set from one year to the next, but we have tracked more cases of forced returns in the past year than in previous years. You know, one of the upsides of technology is that it has given us much greater visibility into some of the cases of North Koreans in China who desperately need assistance. And at a time when the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees can't/won't exercise its protection mandate, it has the mandate to go out and help those people. And it's effectively prevented from doing that. It's a much larger problem in Geneva than what's happening in the office in Beijing. But I think unless and until that problem for UNHCR can be fixed, the US and other like-minded governments should come together to think about how to actually provide some protection to those people. You know, often when we raise that issue, actually, ironically, one of the answers we get back is that nobody wants to encourage the further trafficking of North Koreans through China, as if assisting these people would somehow increase traffickers' business. In our standards, that's a second-order problem. You save people first. You keep them from being sent back to North Korea. That's the first-line obligation, and we need to see more governments willing to actually put a plan in place for that. On the topic of dialogues, we've talked about this a lot over the years. I think it's very important that the larger context be considered. We've always been of the view that the Chinese government doesn't really take other governments' interventions about human rights seriously unless it's coming from the absolute top all the way down through a system. I think in that sense, the president's trip was extremely problematic. Because he essentially showed up and said he thought that President Xi was doing a great job, which is going to make it extremely difficult for anybody further down in the system to effectively weigh in and not have their Chinese counterparts say, but your boss just said that our boss was doing a great job. The dialogues have been very problematic over the years because they are so contained and so siloed. I don't want it to fall off the agenda, obviously. The current framework of having only these 4 dialogues in which we're told, but given no evidence that human rights issues have been raised or raised in an effective manner, I think are extremely problematic. We have some ideas about what could be done instead. For example, shadow dialogues with independent civil society. This is something we've recommended to the EU for years, as its dialogues have gotten boxed in. But I'd be happy to share some of our thinking about how to build this in the current environment and make it relevant for human rights defenders from China.
If you could, and make it part of the record as well, but as well as convey to us
Of course,
all
happy to.
personally, that would be great. You know, on your point, before we go into the final, yesterday the testimony couldn't have been clearer. We had Bob King, as our former special envoy, testify, and he noted that the numbers had dropped from 3,000 making their way into South Korea to 1,500, that was in 2011, last year, and this year it's even a slower pace. So Xi Jinping is actually further tightening the grip on those who successfully make it into South Korea, which is, again, a very, very horrible trend. Please.
I'd like to address the question of the World Internet Conference and Confucius Institutes. It seems to me that the United States is accustomed to dealing with or engaging with the world from a position of strength, not just comprehensive economic and military strength, but also a deep confidence of the enduring appeal of our values around the world. And that, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall, has produced a certain amount of complacency. We thought game over. I don't think China ended the game. And I believe that we are now playing different games, and the United States needs to get its game back on. Our confidence about our strengths, our power, our soft power, not just our hard power, has produced the language of responsible stakeholding, convergence. They'll become more like us if we simply open our institutions to them and show them how fabulous we are. China's the first country, I think, this century to challenge that from a position of comprehensive strength. They are large, they're increasingly rich, increasingly militarily powerful. And so we need to dig deep. Our way, I think, of dealing with a lot of these issues is to harden our own institutions, some of which are developing cracks. Academia, the media, other institutions. China is exploiting those cracks, and it is doing it in ways that, well, frankly, are brilliant. But if our best response to these exploitations is to strengthen ourselves, to raise consciousness, to get our game back on, and to reinvest in ourselves. And so I think it's a question of values. Senator King raised this earlier. To the extent that we regard our engagements with them as purely transactional and disengage values from it, then Tim Cook can talk, optimistically about a day when China may suddenly open up without having to confront the problem of the China of today.
And that is a continuation of Obama's strategy. I remember the Washington Post when the previous, not Xi Jinping, the previous premier was here, the Washington Post did a scathing editorial when he was asked about why Liu Xiaobo was not brought up. Here you are with the Nobel Peace Prize winner, with the jailer, sitting at a joint press conference. And the President Obama said, well, maybe, they have a different system and they have a different culture, which I found to be very, very disturbing. I mean, Chinese people understand human rights. Look at Taiwan, how it has flourished, and people who have suffered so much for their human rights by going to the Laogai and suffering repression. And the Post did a scathing editorial about that. So it's a continuation of an egregiously flawed policy and mindset, in my opinion, which is why, again, we need to get human rights front and center, which is what this commission tries so valiantly to do under Mr. Rubio. Thank you.
Senator King?
I promised Senator Rubio a brief question, but it's a big one. There's been sort of an assumption through this hearing that the intentions of China are malign. I don't know whether that's true or not. Here's my question, and perhaps you could take it for the record and give me a little one-pager. What does China want? What are their goals? Is it military hegemony in the region? Is it simply more powerful economy, richer people? There was a story this morning that they may buy a stake in Aramco in a private offering from Saudi Arabia. Is it access to resources? So I don't think we really have time to delve into this, but I think it's an important question as what are their motivations behind all of this? Is it malign, or is it simply self-interest defined as wanting to be the strongest economy in the world, or certainly in the region? Do they have territorial ambitions? I think it's a question worth asking. I'd appreciate your thoughts for the record. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I guess before we wrap up, I did want to give you all a chance to talk more in depth about the United Front Work Department, one of these agencies that seems to be the umbrella group for influence, because it seems like look, information has always been valuable, right? And our approach to information has largely been to open up our political process here in the United States, allow the world to watch it, and through our example, hopefully influence them and say, you see, you can have a pluralistic society where people disagree about things, they argue about it, and in the end, you can still govern. And we've been less than perfect, but in the process, people have seen our imperfections. And we've debated some substantial societal issues over the last 50 years, some of which seem to bring us to the point of collapse, and yet nevertheless, our nation persevered. What's changed is the democratization of information, in essence, making it so diffuse, so easy to access from so many different sources on an hourly basis has had great positives. It has given us the opportunity for people all over the world to be quickly informed. It's also created the opportunity for people to be misinformed and for information to be denied to them, or only certain information to be provided. And so today we continue with the existing model, and I'm not arguing that we should change it, but you turn on the television and there is a station for every, no matter what your opinion is, there's a station out there prepared to confirm it. We have, in the case of China, an entity or a government that has realized that this is a powerful weapon and that our openness creates the space to provide information over a substantial period of time in a slow and patient way to change the environment. It seems like this agency or department is at the tip of that spear. If you could just talk a little bit about who they are, what they do, but ultimately it seems to be that it is from there where all of these efforts emanate, whether it's sending people, influencing people, providing information, who are they, what's their purview, what do they do?
I think the story has to begin with the history of the Chinese Communist Party as a hunted revolutionary movement over a century ago. They developed very keen strategies, helped by the Soviet Union, in fact, to cultivate allies among influential people in society, to neutralize opposition to the point where they would get the upper hand. The United Front Work Department is the tip of that spear pointed out of China in order to cultivate friends and allies, influence people abroad. Basically, it's their Dale Carnegie strategy of making friends and influencing people and doing it underground in a way that's non-obvious. And so it's a one-stop shop that coordinates national strategy for that purpose. And so the United Front Work Department is engaged with influencing foreign media, influencing foreign academia. There have been, many people carry sort of closet portfolios in the United Front Work Department who are working in Chinese news agency. Their agenda basically is to reshape the international environment in order to make it friendlier to China and advance China's policy goals without seeming to act specifically as the state.
I'll just add to that I think many people outside China circles, and actually, frankly, plenty of people in them too, are not terribly aware of entities like the United Front Work Department. And look, to American or English-speaking political ears, it's a funny-sounding term. It almost sounds like a public works department, as if they took care of the pipes or something like that. And I think there's not much recognition, that the United Front Work Department and other things like the People's Friendship Associations or patriotic fraternal associations are really, at the end of the day, wholly owned subsidiaries of either the Chinese government or the party. They are not independent entities. There's also the reality that as the United Front Work Department approaches political parties or institutions around the world, it's not as if those institutions can then reach out to the alternatives to the United Front Work Department or to a different Chinese political party. They don't get options because those aren't permitted to exist. And there's no rule that says just because you've met with the United Front Work Department, you now need to meet with somebody who's critical of the Chinese government. And so I think as a vehicle, it's very powerful, and there aren't other obvious voices to go out and to listen to.
Just to add briefly to that, which I think those are all very good points, I would also say that it is not only about the United Front Work Department, as we have probably demonstrated in our testimony today. I think, to go back to a concept that I referred to in my testimony, I think that this was in respect to China's system of internet control, but it really could be applied to its system of external influence also. The idea is to have redundancy built into every layer, and so it's not just about what the United Front Work Department is doing. It's also about joint ventures that are entered into with companies, particularly Hollywood or technology, other companies that shape the environment so that China can achieve its strategic interests. If we're not aware of that entire environment, I think we are also probably missing part of the puzzle.
And I think you touched on just a couple little random notes I want to leave on the record so that they're clear that they were discussed today. The first is you just mentioned entertainment in Hollywood. There's been, multiple reports of, and I alluded to it earlier, movie scripts, entertainment that was altered for purposes of ensuring that product had access to the Chinese market. They changed I always got a chuckle. Also, the reports that I read about the Chinese Communist Party were big fans of season 1 of what's the name of that? House of Cards.
House of Cards.
They were not big fans of season 2 for different reasons. So that, again, it's just, I think the average person doesn't realize there are actually movies that are changed here in America because they want to make sure the script is something that doesn't cause it to not have access to this growing important market. So just the strategic use of its consumer power in and of itself could require everything from altering scripts to figuring out what they will require companies to put in these devices in case intelligence officials ever decide to turn it on. So when you see that an American telecom carrier or provider or whatever has signed a deal with a company that has the sponsorship and support of the Chinese Communist Party, you should assume that as part of that, you are inheriting something on this device that could potentially, whether it's on the network or on your device, make you individually vulnerable to surveillance at some point in the future. Again, something that we need to understand, because our companies don't do that. You can't go to them and say, you must put stuff on your phone that allow us to listen to anybody we want, anywhere we want, when we tell you to. We have legal processes if that's even ever done. The second is I want to quote from a report. This will also, I want to, if it's not already, it may be redundant, but I want this full report to be included in the record without objection. It's a December 2017 report this month from the National Endowment for Democracy about Latin America, an area that I spent a lot of time working on in the Foreign Relations Committee. And I quote from it saying, Beijing's strategy clearly targets Latin American elites, prominent regional leaders from multiple fields, including politicians, academics, journalists, former diplomats, current government officials, students, among others, are subtly, that's the key word, subtly being enticed by the Chinese government through personal interaction with the ultimate purpose of gaining their support for China. As a result, many of these renowned and influential people have already become de facto ambassadors of the Chinese cause. And I would add de facto unwitting ambassadors. I don't think they know that they are targeted for this effort. And to some extent, all countries try to do that. They try to convince you in one direction or another, but this is a orchestrated effort in a part of the world. And it goes on to read, the people-to-people engagement money is key. Free of charge trainings, exchange programs, scholarships in China have proven to be effective tools to engage Latin America's regional elites, an idea that was supported in 2016 by Xi Jinping, that when he announced he'd trained 10,000 Latin Americans by 2020. The media and academia are two areas of priority attention for these efforts. Consequently, China is determined to promote cooperation of different kinds between media companies, universities, and think tanks, both at the regional and country level. Education and culture are increasingly important in Beijing's toolkit as well, end quote. And it almost leads me to feel like 50 years from now, when historians write about this period of time, they're going to write that policymakers here were lulled to sleep on a bunch of matters while this massive effort was happening right underneath us, and we didn't even realize it. It's almost the analogy of the frog in the boiling pot. You know, if you throw it in the boiling pot, it jumps right out, but if you let it sit there as the water heats up, it never even notices they're being boiled to death. On another matter of interest that I want to make sure is noted is a Wall Street Journal article that reported Facebook is trying everything to re-enter China, including developing censorship tools. And I want the record to reflect that at an open hearing of the Intelligence Committee, I asked specifically about it, and the answer from the General Counsel was, and I believe it was the General Counsel was, we comply with the laws of the countries that we operate in. And so what that basically means is that Facebook, at least according to the information provided to us, was prepared to install censorship filters in order to get access to China and their market. And it's an important thing to remember as we move forward. I have a final question, and this is really relates to the first point that I was making. Just as they undertake those efforts in Latin America, I think there's evidence that those efforts exist here as well. And you all alluded to a moment ago about a representative of the RNC that was in China recently at a conference on political parties. We know there's extensive travel, members of Congress and staff. And I guess my question is, what can we better do to educate staffers on lobbyists or people-to-people exchange opportunities that are sponsored by, whether it's the United Front or its affiliated organizations or anyone? In essence, is it not incumbent upon, we're not going to prevent these trips, but isn't it incumbent upon us to inform members of our staff and members of the House and Senate that when you go on these trips, here's why they do the trips. This is the kind of things they do. By the way, they're not the only country in the world that does it. The Cuban government does this as well. But shouldn't there be something in place, a protocol in place, where when you accept one of these trips from certain countries, you are made aware of the fact that these trips are not done the way Belgium does them or somebody else does them? There is a rationale behind it, and that is to win you over to their narrative and to what they want policy to be.
I'm happy to give you the affirmative yes. There should be a protocol that does that. I agree that those trips shouldn't be prevented, but people need to understand why they've been asked and how the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government will construe their accepting those offers.
Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that. There needs to be a tremendous amount of consciousness raising on the depth and sophistication of the influence operations that are going on in the United States. And beyond that, people who are invited to go should understand that they've probably been invited for very specific reasons, because of who they are, what their views might be, or where they sit in an organizational food chain in order to exercise that kind of influence that the Chinese government is hoping to have over them and potentially policy making.
And I would just add to step back and put it in the context of democracies in general, and in particular the emerging and vulnerable democracies that you referred to in Latin America and elsewhere. There is a distinct lack of knowledge about China in many of these places, particularly in the countries in Latin America, in the countries that make up China's 16+1 initiative in Central and Eastern Europe. There is not that deep breadth of knowledge, which is demonstrated by my fellow panelists here, that can speak to these issues. And so a lot of times these people go into these exchanges with no context. And so, what I would like to see happen generally in democracies is for there to be more context and learning around this, more transparency, and perhaps some kind of, as you get through that, voluntary agreement to certain norms around whether it's exchanges or academic publishing or anything, but something that allows people to feel that they are not in it alone. So if you're a university that's being approached by a Chinese counterpart and asked to compromise your academic freedom, you can reach out to others and understand that there's a common understanding of what is and isn't beneficial to democracies in that regard. And that's, I think, would be a good first step.
A final quick question. We're running out of time. Are any of you aware of efforts, whether it's in academia and entertainment or anywhere, for universities, for example, to come together and confront this threat to academic freedom, establish some level of standards about what they will and will not do in the universities, a collective effort to all affirmatively say, we don't care if you're going to deny us trips and access to the marketplace or even to students or to exchanges or the ability to have a campus on the mainland. We are not going to allow you to pressure and undermine academic freedom. Are you aware of any such efforts to create some sort of joint effort, whether it's in the entertainment industry or in academia?
I think they're incipient. I hope that they continue and develop further. There are conversations that are beginning to happen along those lines as consciousness about the breadth of influence operations is getting raised. We're nowhere near where we need to be, though.
Just by chance, I happened to spend Sunday morning with a group of China-focused academics, and this issue dominated our conversation. And I think it's fair to say that there's enormous interest in having some sort of set of principles or a code of conduct, but I think there's also a recognition of how difficult it would be to get institutions to sign on to that for fears about loss of funding or the desires of fundraisers or administrators versus the interests of faculty. But I think there is momentum to capitalize on.
And I've seen that incipient movement, which I think is terrific. I do think that that is more likely to occur in institutions that already privilege certain types of democratic expression, such as university campuses or media organizations, in areas such as technology or entertainment companies where the motive is to access China's market, and there is no underlying value base there. I think that is much more difficult.
Well, then I'll close with these three very quick comments as a matter of, I suppose, personal privilege in this regard. The first is, I hope my colleagues, if they ever read this record or it's ever reported, what we're about to talk about here, or what we've talked about here today, realize that big companies, corporations, business interests, their obligation is to their shareholders and or owners to make money. China is an enormous marketplace, and so they are driven by that, and they are prepared to advocate for virtually anything that allows them access to that marketplace. They are not, just because they have an English name and happen to be headquartered in the United States, does not make them advocates of the principles that we need to balance as public policymakers. And we should be wary of that, because oftentimes some of the strongest advocates for tyrannical regimes are the businesses and individuals that are making good money in that market due to their relationship with the current tyrannical government, and their basic argument is, don't mess it up. Yeah, we've got a good thing going, and we've lived through that with Russian sanctions, to some extent a little bit with Venezuela sanctions, and clearly when it comes to China over and over again. Which leads me to my second point, and that is kind of a sense of frustration about this issue. The reaction to today's hearing will be one of two things. Number one, largely ignored, or number two, the argument that we're paranoid, that this is paranoia, this is ridiculous, this is not at all what's happening, and of course that furthers the narrative that the Chinese Communist Party is always putting out, that we're just a small, poor country trying to just catch up to where you are. We're not in any way threat to you. But the first part of ignoring really bothers me, because there'll be a lot of coverage today about whatever the president or someone else tweeted this morning. Meanwhile, this extraordinary geopolitical issue that has incredible historical importance of a way that people will write and talk about for a century is happening right underneath us, and very few people realize it, and those that do would rather talk about whatever the outrage of the day is. I don't even know. I haven't gone online to see what it is. And the last point, and I always make this in these hearings, is I want to be abundantly clear. This is not about the Chinese people. It's not even about China, who we hope will emerge. It doesn't have to have our system of government per se. There's all sorts of different ways to structure democracies. No one is more hopeful than we are, and me personally, to have a China that is a partner in the international community. Can you imagine what a China that respects human rights and the liberty and the dignity of all people, their own and others abroad, could do in partnership with the United States, the issues we could confront and solve? It would be extraordinary development in human events if that were to occur. So this is in no way a hostility towards the people. On the contrary, I have incredible respect for the achievements and the importance of Chinese culture and Chinese history, a nation that for almost all of human history has been the most important or one of the most important in the world, has made extraordinary contributions in the arts and the sciences and in learning and academia. I want that potential and that history to be unleashed to change the world in a positive way. Unfortunately, that is not what we see. What we see here on the behalf of the government and the Communist Party is an effort to roll back the advances towards human freedom that have been made over the last 100 years, and particularly since the end of the Second World War. And that's also important to communicate, because sometimes when we talk about China, it means in the minds of some that we're talking about the Chinese, and we are not. We are fully cognizant that in a nation that large with that many people, there are hundreds of millions of people who aspire to a different way forward, but simply do not have the way to advocate for it, or are punished for advocating for it, sometimes even with their lives. And so that's always important to leave clear on the record. So with that, the record for this hearing, as I said at the outset, is going to remain open for 48 hours, so additional documents and information can be provided. I thank all of you for being here, for your patience. It's been a long hearing, but I think an important one. We're adjourned.